All right, and now let's see how we can set up asynchronous functionality with a Redux Toolkit. So here's the plan. So I have Course API, basically an API that serves some JSON data just so we can practice on fetching data. And in the extraReducer project, we already work with this URL. So it's Course API and then React extraReducer card project, which essentially returns the same data that we currently have in the card items. So use this URL to fetch data when initially our application loads. And here's the thing, we cannot just simply set this up in our current reducers. It's not going to work. That's why with Redux Toolkit, we install another library, the thunk one. And from the Redux Toolkit, we get this CreateAsyncThunk. And we right away want to invoke it. And the result we want to export. So this is something that will require directly in our components. So it's very similar to how we exported the action creators from the reducers. However, in this case, we export this directly. In my case, I'm going to call this get cart items. So we invoke CreateAsyncThunk, and it's looking for two things. For the action type, so essentially in here, we just come up with a name of our action. And second is going to be that callback function. Now, in the following video, I'll show you more options, but at the very least, we pass here this function, and this function needs to return a promise. I'm just using fetch to fetch data. And remember, when we go with fetch.then, we return basically a success response, and with catch, of course, it's going to be the error. But regardless, from this function, we are automatically returning the promise. This is what the callback function is looking for. It's looking for that promise. And of course, you're not limited to the just fetch. You can set up all kinds of things in here, but just remember that this function needs to return a promise. So, of course, if you just stick async in front of it, then by default it's going to return a promise, which is something that we'll take a look at in the next video. And then in the fetch, I want to pass in the URL. So the one that gets me the product. And when it comes to this callback function, it returns a lifecycle actions. So if you remember, when we work with promises, we had a few options. Promise could be pending. It can be fulfilled and rejected. So where we have the create slice, what we want to do is set up extraReducers property. It's going to be an object. And then in order to access those lifecycle actions, the syntax is like this, where we go with name, what we're getting back, and then dot pending, fulfilled, and rejected. And yes, these need to match to the T because they are provided by the Redux Toolkit. And then we want to enclose this with the square brackets. And then we'll set this equal to a function. So what do we want to do when we're pending? Basically, when we're loading, and that's why we have the state value is loading, and we'll set it equal to true. Then what do we want to do if we're successful? And this is the case where the data that we're returning, in the case of success, in our case, response.json is going to be located in the action payload. And of course, we'll log it just so you can see. So once we have successfully data, we want to set is loading to false and card items to the actual payload. And if there's some kind of error, we have rejected option. And in that case, for this application, we just want to set is loading to false. And also keep in mind that when it comes to fetch, 404 is not an error. So we'll only have this one if there's some kind of network error. And at the very last, we want to grab get card items in the app component. And then when our application loads, we want to do two things. We want to dispatch get card items, so the asynchronous function. And then we also want to grab is loading from the state. And while we're loading, we'll display this. And once we're successful, we'll set the state cart items equal to the data that we're getting back. So let's try this one out, where I'm going to go to cart slice. And first, I want to grab that CreateAsyncThunk. So that one is coming from Redux Toolkit. Then I want to set up the URL. So right after the import, let's go here with const URL. And you have two options. You can either get it from README or you can just navigate here in the browser. So since I already have it open in the browser, I'll use this approach. So again, this is the URL where we can fetch those products just like we have in the cart items. And then let's keep on scrolling and we'll go with CreateAsyncThunk and we'll set it equal to our function. But we want to right away export this. So let's say const get cart items, and that is equal to CreateAsyncThunk. And like I said, it's looking for two things. The type. So in here, we just need to come up with a name. In my case, I'm going to go with cart / get cart items. So that's going to be my action. And second will be that callback function. And here, let's right away go with return fetch. Let's pass in the URL, then .then. So if we're successful, I want to turn this into a JSON. So say response JSON. Let's invoke that. And then let's also go with catch. And don't worry, in the next video, we'll take a look at more reasonable approach how to handle this. But for the time being, I just want to get that data from the URL. So let's go here with error and then log that sucker. And once we're done, we want to keep on scrolling. And in the create slice, right after reducers, the property name is extraReducers. Notice we right away get that suggestion. And like I said, then we get those lifecycle actions. So for every function that we will create, in this case, it is get cart items, we'll get those three lifecycle actions: pending, fulfilled, and rejected. And the way we can access that, we go with the same name. So get cart items in this case. And then notice we right away have those options: fulfilled, pending, and rejected. So in my case, I'm going to start with pending. That is while we're still loading. And in this function, same way we can access the state, and also we can get the action. So action is going to be useful once we get the data. For now, while we're pending, we just want to grab the state, and I want to set the state is loading value equal to what? Equal to true, correct? So while we're loading, is loading will be equal to true. Then we want to copy and paste like so. We just want to add the commas so there's no bugs in here. And we want to change these ones around, where instead of pending, now I'm looking for fulfilled. And in this case, I do want to add another parameter, which is going to be action. And again, this action will contain the result if we're successful. So in this case, if we're successful, we return the JSON response. And what I'm going to do is set my cart items, so state, and then cart items equal to what? Well, action and payload. And yes, let's also log it just so you can see where it's coming from, but I can tell you right away that there's a payload property, and that's the one that holds those cart items. So let's log the action. And lastly, we also have rejected. And like I said, since we're using fetch, it's only for network errors. And for time being, we'll set this equal to false. And also, there's a tiny issue here. Once we have the data, of course, the loading will be false. So we don't need to export this. We're actually in good shape. We already export that function here with export. Now we just want to go to app.js. We want to grab the function get cart items. We want to invoke it once our application loads, and we also want to check for is loading. So let's navigate to app.js. And since we already import the calculate totals from the cart slice, simply want to add a comma, and we'll go with get cart items. And then let's keep on moving. Not only I want to get the cart items, I also want to check for is loading. So if we're loading, then we'll display different return. And then let's set up a different use effect, where I'm going to go with use effect and I'll invoke it only when my application loads. So once my application loads, what do I want to do? I want to dispatch, and we'll go with get cart items, and we'll invoke it. Let's also set up that return, where basically, if we're loading, this is what we want to return. We want to go with div with class of loading and then heading 1 loading. So let's set it up here. If is loading is true, then we want to go with return. Then let's set up the div here. Let's add a class of loading. And then inside of it, we're going to go with heading 1 and loading ... And once we save, for a second, we'll notice that loading, and then we get the product. And if you don't believe me, let's navigate to the big screen over here. Let's refresh, and then let's check it out. In here, we have the pending, which is going to be for that loading one, and we can clearly see our state. So notice how awesome it is in the Redux DevTools, where you can clearly see your actions. So what actions we're dispatching and what is the state at that time. And we can even see the difference. So basically, if I'm going to go here with fulfilled, notice this is going to be the difference. So in the cart, we basically get this is loading, and we set it equal to false. And also in the console, we can see what we're getting back. Remember, I said that once we log over here in the cart slice, we are logging the action. So what is in this action? It is a payload, and that's the data that we're getting back. So we have this array of 4 items. We set here state cart items equal to the payload. So again, something we can definitely double check over here. So if I go here with state, notice with fulfilled, for example, this is going to get me those cart items, those 4 cart items. And one more thing that we can actually do is go back to the cart slice and set this equal to an empty array. So the cart items, and that way you'll clearly see how we can change this once the data gets here asynchronously. So let's navigate back again. Let's refresh just so we're on the safe side. And if we go right now with action fulfilled, and if we take a look at the difference, now I'll notice 2 things. First of all, is loading changed from true to false. And also notice how we switched the cart items. So initially it was empty array, and now essentially we get those 4 items. And again, all of our functionality still works. We can clearly see that in our actions over here. But now we're getting this data asynchronously once our application loads.